There we go. All right, just letting a couple more people in. Okay, again, thank you for joining us for the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History Lunch and Learn, Slavery's Hinterlands, Rural New England in the Atlantic World. Our presenter today, Isaac Lee, is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he is broadly interested in the histories of race, slavery, and colonialism in the early modern Atlantic world. His research explores the relationship between slavery and state development with a particular emphasis on the powers of local governments in colonial New England. Isaac is a New England Regional Fellowship Consortium grantee, and he was at the museum in the early fall to conduct his research. So we're really looking forward to hearing a little bit about his findings today. So welcome, Isaac. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jen. I just want to first thank you again for organizing this event, for sending all the emails and doing all the publicity. This is very kind of you. And when I got a New England Regional Fellowship Consortium, I didn't realize that also that part of the excitement of the fellowship is that I get a chance to kind of talk about my research to other people. And so thank you all for making the time over your lunch hour. For maybe not the most uplifting topic, but hopefully something I think that everyone will find interesting. And as a Wisconsinite, a native Wisconsinite, I am surprisingly, I always like learning more and more about Connecticut. And this is like a great opportunity for me. And I really can't say enough about how great the CHS is, the collections, and everything. So my presentation today concerns the history of slavery in early America. More specifically, it tries to shed light on some aspects of slavery that I don't think get enough attention, and that's slavery in rural areas in the North. My presentation today considers two aspects of slavery in Connecticut. One, and this is will be more of the focus, is the economic ties between Connecticut and the Caribbean. But I also want to spend some time today thinking a little bit about what life was like for the enslaved themselves, who found themselves in the hinterlands of New England society. Now, when the subject of slavery comes up, I think the typical association that comes to mind are the cotton plantations of the American South in the 19th century. And there's good reason for this. But today I'm going to focus on a much different time and place, as is kind of hopefully gestured towards by my title slide. So, I mean, and indeed, by the time Eli Whitney invented his cotton gin in 1793, marking a massive shift in the global economy centered around slave-grown cotton, enslaved people had actually been living in New England for over a century at that point. And I think for those interested in the history of slavery, looking at unexpected places like 18th century Connecticut is important, not simply as a reminder that bondage existed outside of the South, but as a way of better understanding how and why the institution of slavery changed over time. And indeed, after spending, I think, a couple of weeks in the CHS this fall, or a week in the CHS this fall, the thing that stuck out to me most was just how often I could find these little archival fragments that to me suggested something about Connecticut's ties to this larger Atlantic world. Now, explaining what exactly rural New England has to do with slavery requires a little bit of background history on the development of colonial North America and the role of slave labor in this transformation. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the history we most commonly think of is perhaps the 19th century in the Cotton South. And while this history is crucial, I think it obscures how widespread slavery and its economic ties were throughout early American history. Obviously, in recent years, public-facing scholarship, most notably the 1619 Project, has helped bring attention to just how long slavery has been a feature of American history. But even this project just scratches the surface, I think, of how slavery actually shaped North America and what would become the United States. The English Puritans who broke off from Massachusetts to found their own colonial settlement in what is today Connecticut lived in a world that was very familiar with slavery. For example, the first set of laws, the 1646 Connecticut Code of Laws, officially published in 1650, proposed Indian and African slavery as a legal form of punishment. And indeed, by the time of the colony's founding, English colonists were, in essence, I think, kind of trying to catch up with the Portuguese and especially Spanish colonists who had grown wealthy and powerful through colonial projects that depended heavily on slave labor. So by the time of Connecticut's founding, the use of African slaves was something of an established precedent. Consequently, enslaved Africans constituted a significant portion of colonial America's workforce, particularly in the realm of agricultural labor. Between 1600 and 1775, European slave traders transported nearly 2 million Africans to both the Caribbean and the North American mainland. And although slavery had existed in previous human societies for thousands of years, European colonists introduced a form of bondage that was radically different in its violence and brutality from the forms of social and economic organization that had existed in Europe, Africa, and as well as in indigenous societies. The Africans who were forced into slavery underwent a process that commodified not only their labor, but their very bodies through sophisticated practices of accounting and finance. And those who endured the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade were bought, sold, and even taxed as if they were property. These practices underwrote a highly violent system of racialized chattel slavery, allowing planters and merchants to maintain massive enslaved labor forces capable of producing staple crops at surplus levels. The production of staple crops secured the place of the North American colonies within the lucrative commercial networks of the Atlantic world. And so here I kind of want to turn to, again, I promise we'll get back to Connecticut, but I want to quickly kind of emphasize, this is a map of Barbados. And Barbados is indicative of these Caribbean islands that merge in the middle point of the 17th century and become just basically giant factories for staple crops. Tobacco, indigo, coffee, and rice all become crucial exports that allow colonists to balance their accounts with English merchants. The one crop that stands out the most, though, in this move is sugar. The 17th century English adventurers who failed to find gold and silver in these islands that they were hoping to find instead copied another thing the Spanish had done, which is setting up sugar plantations. And as you can kind of see from this map of Barbados, basically the entire landscape of this island, which was relatively flat and thus kind of perfect for planting, basically every inch of this island becomes dedicated to sugar cultivation. And this becomes kind of crucial because consequently, because every single part of this island is dedicated to sugar production, there's not much room for anything else. Most importantly, food and other kinds of supplies. And this is where New England comes in. In this way, the growing strength of the economy of British North America, particularly New England, was directly related to slavery. Because Caribbean islands like Barbados were basically incapable of supporting themselves, these slave societies became dependent on New Englanders. New Englanders were the first to realize this and really capitalize on this market. And Connecticut supplied Caribbean islands with food, livestock, and timber. Connecticut's own economic development reflected the needs of Caribbean slavery. And we can kind of, I'll begin to kind of explore this in some of my findings. By the 18th century, wealth generated by West Indian islands like Jamaica and Barbados had become essential to the economic stability of places like Connecticut. Sugar not only raised the fortunes of planters and merchants, but a vast network of tradesmen, sailors, farmers, and fishermen throughout the Atlantic world. And even, this is obviously just a drawing, but just even something as simple as timber, something that we kind of expect when we think of maybe 300 years ago, we imagine worlds kind of the new world overflowing with trees and uncultivated wilderness. And Barbados was very quickly leveled, and thus these islands became, for shipping, for any kind of structures, became very dependent on places like Connecticut. Let's see. Now here we'll go back to this is a 1670s map of New England. So it's this set of economic relations that really drew me to the history of New England. And I think while today we're very familiar with our kind of globalized world of internationally exchanged commodities, this is hardly a new phenomenon. And just as our use of Chinese-made iPhones or Swedish furniture create all kinds of social, cultural, and political consequences, so too did New England's ties to these Caribbean islands. And indeed, I think, as I kind of said during my first week at the CHS, as I looked through these collections, I was constantly reminded of the subtle yet powerful ways that slavery was present in early Connecticut. And it's just an example of this. Just to kind of start with, this image captures the type of document that was extremely commonplace: a record or receipt, excuse me, of trading goods. This receipt in particular comes from the papers of Jonathan Trumbull Sr., who was born in Lebanon, Connecticut, and eventually became the governor of Connecticut during the American Revolution. Prior to his political rise, Trumbull followed his father and became a merchant. Unlike most colonial traders who went through middlemen in Boston or New York, Trumbull was actually kind of unique in that he established direct connections with London-based merchants. As you'll see in the top left corner, this is a receipt produced in a London trading house. On the right corner of the document, you'll see a name, Stork and Champion, which is the London-based firm with which Trumbull is trading. But I think as we look through the list of goods circulated through the Atlantic world, a story begins to emerge where enslaved produced sugars from places like Jamaica, St. Kitts, Antigua, Montserrat, Nevis, and Barbados provided the basis for trade goods like coffee, cocoa, and rum making their way back to Connecticut. I think this from Trumbull's papers offers a much easier to read version of the kinds of accounts that generally are what I work with in my research. This is a picture of Jonathan Trumbull himself. It's a kind of scary looking picture, but that's him nonetheless. But this is this is probably more of the bread and butter of this kind of research that I'm interested in. That you'll see a kind of an invoice for 16 carts of rum that's going back and forth between Connecticut and Barbados. This is from William Moll's account book. Moll was an agent in Barbados who, and this is occasionally you find men like Moll who are English agents who kind of work to facilitate trade with who stay in these islands that are otherwise kind of very undesirable places to live, and to kind of facilitate trades. Mostly in Moll's case, we learn from his account books and pages like this, mostly horses and lumber from Connecticut to Barbados kind of formed the basis of these exchanges for sugar and rum. Another correspondence that was again another hard to read one, but this is just another more fully written out kind of letter of exchange talking about horses going to Barbados. Horses, I think, and I'm going to pause here for a second. Horses I think are particularly interesting and a noteworthy way of connecting rural Connecticut and the hinterlands to Caribbean slavery. Horses were a particularly valuable commodity, and especially on slave plantations. And on islands like Barbados and Jamaica, especially, horses were essential militarily for the kinds of cavalry units that policed the enslaved and fought against enslaved rebellions. Of course, raising cattle, mules, and horses had been a feature of colonial Connecticut's economy basically since its founding. But what made husbandry most profitable was via trade. And in this way, I think Connecticut offers a pretty straightforward example of what economists call a comparative advantage. That is, the kinds of resources needed to successfully raise horses. Other animals were most readily available in the hinterlands. Now, of course, the problem with an economic concept like a comparative advantage is that it kind of imagines an ideal set of circumstances, right? Where there's a seamless exchange between two willing parties that have no other impediments. And this is very much not the case, as we know, in real life, and particularly when it came to colonial trade. Goods needed to be transported across considerable distances, even before being shipped into the Atlantic. This aspect of Connecticut's trade with the Caribbean, however, I think helps shed light on another aspect of slavery in Connecticut, and that is the lives of the enslaved themselves. Connecticut's population of enslaved Africans grew steadily as Connecticut's economy and trade ties increased. The estimated number of enslaved Africans grew from around 450 in 1700 to over 4,000 individuals by 1750, a near tenfold increase over the course of 50 years. And while the majority of the enslaved remained around port cities like New London, men and women and children of African descent lived and labored in towns and on farms throughout the colony. Now, for these people of African descent, their experiences of enslavement could vary dramatically. For one, I think it's important to point out that ideas of racism developed very differently in places where there was a very small Black population. Unlike on plantations, kind of like what's seen pictured here, where the majority of the people are Black, in places like Connecticut, racial difference is actually more pronounced. So indeed, New Englanders are generally, when I look through, wills, account books, and deeds, New Englanders are actually generally more exacting and consistent with racial identifiers, and they're often more creative as well, with more specific racial identifiers for mixed race peoples, for example, in records I've then in the surviving records from the Caribbean or South Carolina. And again, I just kind of want to emphasize that this is a product of in essence, just like a more what is is a more is less familiarity with people from other places in the world, and in places like Connecticut, and thus, or at least people of African descent, and thus it kind of accentuates and emphasizes their racial difference. And so I think consequently, Connecticut's colonists had a lot more questions to answer about how the enslaved fit into their society. And I think perhaps my favorite example of this that kind of helps illustrate this is, I'm going to come back to that slide in a second, is this this question that was put to Connecticut's General Assembly in 1623. And so the question that's posed to the legislature of colonial Connecticut is, in essence, whether their Act for Highways maintains to Indian and, quote, Negro slaves, and the assembly resolves in the affirmative. And let me explain kind of what's happening here. So in a world before steamrollers or any kind of real equipment to build the kinds of modern roads that we expect today, in colonial times, roads were all done by basically manual labor, right? That is people with shovels and carts digging up, grass and other plants, clearing the ways, and then repacking this dirt, oftentimes with rocks and other things underneath the dirt to kind of help filter and so that the roads don't become too muddy. But so, anyways, this is like hard backbreaking work that is necessary for highways. Oftentimes, actually, colonists would pave over former Indian trails as a way to just kind of use the existing infrastructure of the places that they were settling. But so in any case, the Act for Highways of Connecticut, and this act mirrors similar acts kind of throughout New England, basically stipulates that every year, every resident of Connecticut is expected to perform a certain number of days of highway work. This is, you can kind of think of it almost as like a tax, basically. And of course, the wealthiest in society often buy their way out of this in various means. But this act this notion of kind of contributing your time and labor to your community goes all the way back really to medieval times. And it's, the French have their own version. They call this corvée labor. The English call it statute labor. And basically it's a kind of like feudal obligation to your lord that you perform this work. But this kind of principle really transforms in English law, and colonists themselves take this from English law and they transplant it. And it's a thing that's expected of all residents of a township. And when you look through colonial records, you'll see they are constantly kind of complaining about their roads, which ones are in disorder, which ones are impassable, who has like left trees that they've fallen just kind of sitting around in the middle of it. So they're always complaining about these. So these are actually kind of like, I think, fascinating sites of understanding kind of what life is like, particularly in more rural areas where these highways are essential. And what this act, in essence, suggests, and I find really interesting, this idea that this obligation for roadway extended not only to the white citizens, the white residents of townships throughout Connecticut, but also to indigenous people, indigenous and African slaves. And underscores kind of, I think, just like how the complexity of slavery's kind of integration into Connecticut. And in the sense that we can read this as, yeah, they're just using this to extract more labor from these people, right? But in other colonies, they just would pass other adjacent laws that specified that the enslaved people are responsible for road work, or they would tax the enslavers themselves and use those taxes as a way to kind of funnel this labor in. So the fact that Connecticut's assembly kind of decides in this way has always been really fascinating to me, and suggests that there's a certain kind of familiarity and recognition of the integration of the enslaved themselves into Connecticut society. What this isn't, and just how intertwined this is in everyday life. And as I kind of suggested, earlier, this is a zoomed in picture of a map of 1767 Connecticut, but I just want to underscore that these highways were really just kind of crucial arteries of the colonial economy, and that allowed goods to flow from places like Lebanon and other places in the hinterlands to the port towns of places like New Haven and New London. And it's really kind of interesting. So what we encounter here, I think, is a situation where the enslaved are kind of contributing on all sides of Atlantic trade. But whereas their contributions in the Caribbean are kind of solely based on the fact of their status as property and the kind of very violent coercial of their labor. In Connecticut, on the other side of this exchange, I think we find what I've been calling a kind of like predatory inclusion of Black people into Connecticut society. And I want to be careful here and make sure it's clear that what I'm not saying, and that is that New England slavery was somehow less severe or violent. And this is absolutely not the case. But rather, what I think we can learn from studying places like Connecticut is that the enslaved face very different circumstances, which scholars are still trying to recover. And like so many of society's most marginalized, the lives of colonial Connecticut's rural Black population remains relatively obscure. But thanks to places like the Connecticut Historical Society, we can begin to find fragments of these kinds of what life was like. Now, I gesture back to my title slide. I just want to kind of explain it for a moment. This is an artistic rendering of Stonington, Connecticut, and particularly the idea is this is a rendering of the place where Venture Smith lived part of his life. And for those who are familiar with Connecticut slavery, that's the name Venture Smith will surely kind of ring a bell. He's one of the most well-known enslaved individuals that we kind of know about. He is born in Africa and he's born in West Africa. He's taking over the slave trade, and he ends up via Barbados in Connecticut. And he's particularly well known because he writes one of the very few colonial era slave narratives that we have. And it's actually very easily accessible online, and I would encourage anyone that's kind of interested in this topic. It's a relatively short narrative. It's only a couple chapters, and they're all short, and it's really fascinating. His own kind of account of his life in Africa, and this is and there's scholars have written a lot about Smith, but and this artistic rendering that we have here is of this household and what we kind of can imagine this might have looked like. I really kind of like love this imagery, and I think it kind of captures to me what I ultimately and kind of one of the aspirations of my project is to kind of help show that when we think of the hinterlands of New England, that these are places that are filled with many different kinds of people that come from all over the world, and that we can kind of bring this, and that it's the job of the historian to kind of try to draw these out. And so I'll just kind of, in my remaining time, I'll kind of just try to walk through very briefly a couple of the documents that I found, a couple of these cases that I think gesture towards the fact that there is a world of people like Venture Smith who unfortunately didn't have the opportunity to write their own, to present their own narratives, but that have these really kind of fascinating stories of their lives in Connecticut nonetheless. This is a court document that is from Jonathan Trumbull's collection, and that he was one of his many positions. He was a judge in Lebanon, and so this is the story though that comes out of this is that a French man named Peter Lemieux, who was from Nova Scotia, is passing through Lebanon, and he loses 9 pounds 12 shillings worth of silver, and he suspects that 3 enslaved people, 2 women, one named Phyllis and one named Sybil, and another enslaved man who my best guess of how the writing suggests his name is Son, but I think I might be misreading the first letter. But in any case, he accuses these 3 enslaved individuals of taking the silver, and is demanding their arrest. And that the sheriff of Windham County and whoever is able, and is deputized to take anyone that he can find to help arrest these three individuals. And I think this story of and this is from 1756, I believe, 57, excuse me. And I think the story points us towards a couple of interesting features of kind of rural life in Connecticut for the enslaved. One, it's I think unsurprising that three people are named here because in general, when we find kind of conspiracies like this, colonial officials are very eager to kind of immediately kind of pin the blame on people who they've seen hanging out and kind of associating before, and thus it's this kind of example I think underscores the vulnerability of Black people in places I think throughout North America, but in these particular circumstances and the kind of liability they face before the law. And there's a well-documented history of kind of the enslaved being blamed for any kinds of breaches of the peace. And in particular, there's a kind of constant fear of the enslaved kind of nightlife activities. And they're constantly kind of, citizens are kind of constantly asking constables and sheriffs to provide kind of more rigorous policing of particularly after curfew hours of the people who are moving around. This story is again just kind of is a very small one, but that just gestures towards a world in which these people are all kind of known, and that but that their kind of criminality is very easily assumed. And one other, and this is one, to be frank, that I'm still kind of like, this is just a very small little fragment that I'm working through, but that I just find really interesting. I'd love to hear people's thoughts. Is that this is taken from an account book of a constable in Hartford, Connecticut, named Caleb Stanley. The full page is on the left, and what I've done on the right is I've kind of zoomed in on this one line. It's the way these account books and the way a constable who is kind of not quite a police officer, but a kind of proto police officer in the 1700s. But what this what this account traces is all the various charges that this official both took on, the monies he took on, and then gave out in his daily responsibilities. And in the middle, we have this line that says, to pay to Abda for whipping Jonathan Parsons. And Abda was an enslaved person who lived in Hartford at this time. He's manumitted a couple years after this in a kind of very interesting case that sets up an interesting precedent in Connecticut's laws of slavery that eventually comes to play during the period of manumission. But to be perfectly honest, this is like I think this is really interesting that he is, in essence, that this person is then being tasked with carrying out the public punishment of someone else. Whipping was not an uncommon punishment for all kinds of people. It was kind of seen as a way to discipline laborers in general, and it's and throughout New England, this is kind of, particularly children are often, when apprentices, this is something that can happen. Women adulterers are whipped. It's kind of a common punishment, but constables are generally responsible for this, and so I've always been very curious about the fact that, or excuse me, as soon as I found this, I've been trying to kind of think about the implications of what it means to have a person of African descent. Abda was classified as, in the language of the day, as, quote, a mulatto, but to have this person charged with carrying out a kind of public function, and this kind of public function in particular, again, kind of underscores what I hope has been a theme throughout my ramblings today, which is just that the way slavery operates and the kind of expected senses of hierarchy, the expected senses of power differ and provide for, I think, a very kind of, like, in some ways more intimate, in some ways more confusing portrait of what slavery was like and what the slave society was like. this is all to say that this research is very much in progress, and I'm still working through lots of these little fragments um, of kind of mentions of people of color, and this is kind of unfortunately what exists in the archival record. Um, but ultimately, what these projects gesture towards is a world full of people. Is a world that is very highly connected, kind of to Atlantic slavery, and that my hope is that by continuing to pursue these fragments, we can kind of bring out more of these stories and a fuller understanding of kind of what it means to really be integrated into a slave society. With that, thank you for your time. I have thank you. I'd love to hear any questions, any thoughts you have about the material. I'm looking forward to coming back to Connecticut and finding more. But thank you for your attention this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Isaac. That was really interesting. There's a lot of really fascinating documents and a whole lot of reading between the lines. So
Yes.
that's a lot of work. Someone was asking about the image, the rendition of the village for Venture Smith. I did put the link where you got it. Could you talk just a little bit about the image or how you found it?
Um, So I'll confess, I don't know a ton about the image itself or the conditions that produced it. As I kind of gestured, Venture Smith is a pretty well-known figure in American history, particularly people interested in Connecticut and people interested in slavery. And he's generated something of a cottage industry of scholars that are interested in different aspects of his life. I think I couldn't find anything else about the artist who produced the drawing, but the site you linked, I'm glad this is gives a really kind of compelling breakdown of Venture Smith's life and kind of what historical archaeologists have been able to find about the area around which he lived. It's John Wood Sweet actually at UNC is working on a new biography of Venture Smith, but which is will hopefully come out soon and is I'm sorry, but all to say that he is a really important figure, is one of the few narratives we have of someone of African descent or who was born in Africa, excuse me, and who has like a relative, and has is able to kind of talk a lot about his life there. And in a lot of ways, this image that I was able to, that this artist rendered is very much in the spirit of what Venture Smith, when you read the last chapter of his kind of narrative and this idea of him as a kind of patriarch that kind of oversees this household after he's manumitted. This is like, in a lot of, I think what some scholars would refer to as this is kind of his status as kind of a big man, which in African history is a kind of construction that people use to talk about kind of political leadership and how kind of communities are organized around someone with who's the big man, the kind of provider for the family, and family being kind of much more broadly construed, not simply just a nuclear genetic based family, but this big man who is this leader. And I think what I really like about this image is, in essence, is this is kind of what I think this farm, that this life he's able to set up for himself in Connecticut is kind of indicative of this. It's in some ways reminiscent of a story of Anthony Johnson, who is another man of African descent who lives in Virginia, who is able to kind of buy his own land and actually owns his own slaves even. But we have these stories of these people like this, and I think it kind of captures something of Venture Smith's both Connecticutness and his Africanness. So I really like the image.
Yeah, it's amazing. So we had a question from Star. Were the interactions between colonial New England and the South? If so, what type of interactions were they based on trade or slave exchange?
Great question. And thank you. There are definitely increasing amounts of interaction between New England and, particularly at first, Virginia and South Carolina are kind of premier economic powers in the South, and then steadily over time it shifts. One of the this is not a Connecticut based story, but one of the most interesting things that I want to learn more about is that a lot of the really wealthy slavers in Charleston, South Carolina, would go to Newport in the summers, because Charleston's hot and and particularly diseases were a real issue. So the wealthiest would show up to Newport, and this has obviously been now kind of has turned into something of a long-standing tradition. But in general, there's both communication between, like, there are, like, exchanges between, like, ships that will go, but like kind of across the coast and end up in different, like, traders that are based in New England that will kind of trade between the South. But then there's also by the end of the 18th century, actually, there is something of competition that emerges over things like the livestock trade, where where South Carolina in particular becomes really kind of starts to really be able to, as it moves westward and expands, starts to open up more land and starts to be much more kind of capable in husbandry, and thus they actually start to kind of compete with New Englanders a little bit over provisioning the Caribbean, and that forces, like, New Englanders to kind of adapt and to kind of develop new economic strategies to kind of maintain their Caribbean relations. So that's actually one of the more interesting things. But there's definitely, and even just when you can see even in the legal codes, that, between places like South Carolina and Virginia and these Caribbean islands like Barbados really kind of begin to establish the language around policing the enslaved and around the kind of laws that are needed. And you see New Englanders maybe decades later then kind of implementing very similar statutes as their populations of enslaved people start to rise. So that there's a lot of various ways they interact, but it's definitely something I'm interested in and want to learn more about. So thank you for reminding me of that.
Annie had a question. Is there much evidence available of purchases made by Connecticut factories of cotton from Southern plantations?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, and that's definitely, and I would, there's a great study by a Connecticut-based journalist named Anne Farrow. It's called Complicity, and it's how the North was involved in the slave trade. And that book really does a great job of tying Southern cotton to the turn of the century, to the kind of early mills in Connecticut. And Farrow is a journalist by training, but she actually did two great books. One, this book called Complicity, and the other, she looked at this log book that may be familiar to some, that's held in Connecticut, that just kind of traces various exchanges during the 18th century between traders, slave traders specifically in Connecticut. The slave trade was not super popular in Connecticut. It was Rhode Island was the much bigger slave trader in the New England region, but Connecticut does have some voyages come out, and Farrow's written about that as well. But for the provisioning of mills in particular, Complicity is really good on that.
I just put the link. I mean, not that I'm promoting Amazon, but just so you can see the book.
Yeah,
I put the link for Complicity. Mike is asking, the Connecticut provisioning trade that you mentioned is similar to that of provisioning plantations in the Hudson River Valley. In colonial New York, the trade also included crossing the Atlantic to supply enslaved Africans to the Sugar Islands. Did this also occur in Connecticut? And then a follow-up, did Connecticut slave ships also use enslaved individuals as translators and cooks?
That's a great question, Mike. Thank you for that. So yeah, you're right. You're very right that the provisioning is very similar. And actually, the image I showed of Trumbull's receipt book, that kind of mentions, sugars from Jamaica and all these other various places. It also part of this kind of triangular trade that develops between the North American continent, the Caribbean, and England, is the fur trade. And so the Hudson River Valley is, of course, kind of this is really the kind of capital of the fur trade in a lot of ways. This is a really important region. And then you'll see on that list a list of different animal furs, and Connecticut tries to participate in this as well. And this and that, which and then also kind of breaches a kind of whole other interesting history of, like relations with indigenous people who are the better fur trappers, and how they kind of provide this trade that then gets kind of translated into commodities circulating throughout the Atlantic. So, and you're absolutely right that on slave ships in particular, and Atlantic trips more broadly, cooks on these ships are often Black, which is something that actually, if anyone wants to study, has not really been explored, and is always kind of fascinating me. The people who would act on these voyages, or the people who would accompany on these voyages would occasionally be could certainly be from places like Connecticut. I think more often what you see is people from Africa themselves are taken often. There's this practice called pawn ship, whereby like representatives of African leaders are kind of exchanged as in theory as like goodwill, so tokens of goodwill, but slave traders often keep these pawns, so to speak, and these people are often used in various roles as like translators and things like that. But I guess, but I will say in particular, like in more port cities, like Black people in New York, in particular, also to some extent in New London, but like Black people are often sailors, particularly by the end of the 18th century. That's like, if you're able to free yourself, that's like a very common occupation. Or runaways themselves try to escape to sea and become sailors. So these ships themselves, actually, that are not just slave ships, but just trading ships in general, are actually like a lot more, I think, diverse than we sometimes realize.
I had a question in your research at this point in your project. Have you come across any information about the Black governors in Connecticut or elsewhere? I don't. I think that also happened. I know it happened in
Yeah.
Connecticut. I'm not sure if it happened elsewhere.
I think Rhode Island does this as well, actually. But yeah, that's a really cool history. And I think there's a great book called Black Yankees by William Pearson that kind of talks about these festivals a little bit. But I haven't yet found anything I guess in my own research about the Black governors. And it's this kind of tradition whereby Black communities kind of elect their own kind of leaders, so to speak. And it's they have kind of like these parades and festivals. It gestures towards, I think, a little bit what I kind of mentioned with the case of like the theft, but this kind of like no matter it's kind of always the case that whether enslaved or free Black communities are always people are always able to kind of create new forms of community, and these are always kind of then observed from the outside, these kinds of by white officials, sometimes with anxiety, sometimes with curiosity, and they become these kinds of like but oftentimes the way we learn about them is in law and in court records, and people kind of like prosecuting them in different ways, or attempting to. But I should make a note about that, though. Thanks, John.
I can send you some information that we use in some of our programming as well. We can
Yeah.
swap some information.
Yeah, I will say, like, yeah, in general, like the CHS's website, as I was just kind of like looking around for things to help kind of fill out the presentation, it's just like so full of like great little vignettes about various aspects of Connecticut history. It's a real treasure trove.
Any other questions, anyone? You can also unmute yourself. Ken put a little bit of information about the Maggie Arnold's
Right.
picture. It's acrylic on canvas. from 2010 about his 130-acre homestead in East
Mhm.
Haddam. It's really neat, and it's based on uncovered archaeological evidence that they've uncovered
Yeah.
during surveys. So, thank you,
I'll
Ken.
also, yeah. Also, just I see Elise comment about a school in Vermont, uh, New Milford that was renamed, and I just would add that I think like um, it's really I think important and useful research that a lot, particularly universities, are undertaking now to try to understand their connections to slavery in different capacities. You know, like Yale has done a study, New Haven certainly has lots of ties. Um, this is Brown, I think, was one of the first universities to do this. And the Brown family was obviously really kind of was a huge kind of had a huge involvement in the slave trade. One of the things that I kind of hope to advance with this project, and I'm glad Elise brought this up just because I kind of wanted to say that like I think the renaming project is really important, but it also kind of one of the reasons I'm interested in kind of these hinterland connections that, and it was really gratifying to see that that some folks in the comments say that they hadn't heard of these things before. It's just that these connections were very everyday in a lot of ways, and not simply just kind of conspiracies by the wealthiest in society, but were kind of very ingrained in, you know, as like herding, lumbering, and, you know, transporting things across highway. And it's you know, very kind of hard, I think, to I think it creates a bigger challenge to me in trying to really kind of wrestle with, to borrow Anne Farrow's title, like the complicity of all these different Northerners with slavery. You know, it just it hopefully kind of paints a picture that like larger economic systems and not simply just kind of individuals are at play, and that kind of create these conditions that of 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 where people don't even kind of really realize what they're doing, or not even, I guess, put it that way, but like probably are aware to some extent, but just like kind of uh, don't have the sense of kind of just of like how involved they are. But anyways, that's, you know.
Yeah, I thank you for saying that, because I think that's important for people don't realize there's really no way you weren't involved somehow, whether you were purchasing something or selling something.
Yeah.
So it was very everyday, like as you said. We do have one last question. Karen is asking, do you know if the role or importance coffee played in the slave trade in Connecticut? Have you come across any of that yet? Or
Coffee. No, that is so coffee. I think the answer to that is probably is yes, and I think it kind of develops in a later period. The thing about coffee is that it is more tied to it's more places like Haiti are big coffee producers, and then Suriname, also a big chocolate producer. Um, and so we don't actually know a ton about the ties of these places directly to Connecticut. What I can say, I mean, the thing is that, and I kind of try to gesture towards it with that receipt image, is that by the mid 18th century, you know, colonists are really kind of living in a world where just like the world of commodities are steadily becoming more and more available to people, even as distant as these smaller towns in Stonington and, you know, and Windham County, wherever. This world of commodities is becoming more and more available, and people are, you know, becoming to expect these things more, and thus, you know, like these merchant houses, both in Europe and in the United States, are growing increasingly powerful and are able to kind of command and move commodities from all over. There's definitely more work to be done about coffee, though, because coffee, and it has obviously an interesting relationship to the American Revolution, um, as people kind of get rid of their tea. Um, but Haiti and Suriname are the big places, and Boston has kind of much more established direct ties with Suriname, and Connecticut not as much that I know of. But that's a great question. This is an unsatisfying answer, but it's an answer. It's an answer for which I think I need more coffee myself to keep thinking about.
Uh, and then there's one last question from Elise. have you uncovered anything about enslaved people working in the tobacco fields in Connecticut or involved in the tobacco growing at all?
Huh. That's, that would be the thing about like the way historians always kind of narrate New England slavery is to say that, well, because New England is not great farmland, and thus consequently, like Virginia is obviously the place most known, and Virginia and Maryland are the places most known for tobacco. Um, the thing is that like anywhere there are farms, there are enslaved people working on. Like there are enslaved people working. It's a matter of, I mean, they're not in huge numbers. And the thing about, I guess, and the reason that scholars haven't paid as much attention to it is just because Connecticut's tobacco trade is not as competitive, just on the markets. But that said, it's definitely the case that when you look at farming throughout New England, these people that I kind of like that I gesture towards in the kind of the scrap of the silver theft incident are like these are exactly the people who just kind of end up on farms working, and whether it's tobacco, they're not doing cash crop production in the same way that we envision like cotton and sugar plantations, just because the scale of the agriculture is not as demanding. Um, and thus and actually what's fascinating about that too is is that, like, so they operate as farm laborers, they're enslaved, and thus that means more control, more power. But as Connecticut moves to gradual emancipation, and this is where I kind of wanted to include more some of the things I found about gradual emancipation, but I didn't want to get too far away from the original topic. But I think what it does is it creates a lot of like interesting questions for people living in Connecticut about, it's like, these are my laborers, these are like, and I don't want to lose them. We're phasing out slavery. What does that mean? Kind of like, it creates these, not on the grand scale of emancipation that like the Civil War represents, but again, a more kind of like, again, maybe to use like a more kind of intimate calculus that these people have to decide. And I remember this one document where there's an argument, I think Trumbull's the judge again overseeing this, and there's this slave man named Will who manumits himself, and then who's able to kind of pay for his manumission, but then there's a threat as to whether he's going to be a charge to the town because he's not able to support himself, and whether Will's master is still responsible for him. Will thinks he owes him money. His former enslaver thinks that he's dangerous and wants him like confined. So like, and this is during this kind of period of gradual emancipation where you have like all these former. Sorry, this I realize you asked about tobacco, and I took this question in a very kind of sideways direction, but I guess it just makes me think of these just kind of strange arrangements that then kind of develop as a result.
Thank you. Any other questions? Anybody? Anybody? You can unmute yourself if you like.
Hey, I actually have a question.
Yeah.
Sorry, a few minutes left. Did you have any contact with the John Trumbull House in Lebanon at all, or where are you finding the sources for the?
I haven't had a chance to yet. I've just John Trumbull's become kind of my new hobby horse. I'm just starting to learn more about him. But I just used the collections at the CHS. They have a set of his papers, particularly his merchant life in Lebanon. I suspect his later period, particularly his years as governor, are probably I think I'm almost positive are archived elsewhere, and maybe the Trumbull House has some of those things. But he, because he was he was in public life for so long, he actually generated a ton of papers that you can just have like his signature on it, but that reveal a lot about like life in Lebanon.
Cool.
But that actually, I've been meaning to look at their stuff, and I've never been to the Trumbull House.
I was on their board very, very briefly for a minute, like a decade ago.
Oh, cool.
I don't think they have much or anything in terms of papers, but it's definitely, that's an interesting connection I had no idea about.
I Sorry,
Oh, sorry.
go
Go
ahead.
ahead, Jen. I
No,
was
go
just gonna say,
ahead.
I mean, like, I'll confess, I am, like, I'm a Midwesterner from Wisconsin who kind of came to Connecticut, just very interested in this topic, and kind of learned on the spot. You walk around and there's Trumbull Street. I was like, oh wow, this guy was a big deal. I mean, like, I knew him from Revolutionary history, of course, but like, so I didn't really know much about his life in Lebanon beforehand. It's been interesting to learn more. But Jen, I'm sure you know more actually about.
Well, I just wanted to say we do have, I just put in the chat the papers. We have 12 boxes, so we do have a
Yeah,
pretty decent collection. We do have a finding aid as well that you can get to from our website.
yeah,
So a lot there to uncover.
yeah. Great stuff.
Well, thank you so much, Isaac. This was really fascinating, great discussion, a lot of information that I think was very enlightening for many people. So we appreciate that. Thank you so much, and keep us up to date on your project as it unfolds. For sure. I do want to just end today with sharing a little bit about what we have going upcoming at the museum. Um, if you're interested, we do have on Saturday the 9th, Rachel Beth Sayet is a member of the Mohegan Nation, and she's going to delve into the rich food traditions and celebrations of Indigenous people in New England and how these customs have continued. That is on site at 2 o'clock. And then Thursday the 14th, we're doing another trivia night, which is a blast. That is also on site. This one is the 90s trivia. So the decade that gave us Furby's, Friends, and the Fresh Prince. So please come on out. We will have refreshments, including beer and wine, and of course, extra points if you come in your best 90s attire. Families are welcome. And then on the 19th, we do have our next Lunch and Learn. So again, virtually, we're going to present Remembering G. Fox and Company. And this will be a wonderful overview of the history of the store and, of course, the story of Beatrice Fox Arbach, the pioneering businesswoman who led G. Fox through its golden age. And we do have a large collection of G. Fox material, so it's really fun to talk about and reminisce with everyone that so fondly remembers the store. So please join us. And of course, there's many more events on our website at connecticutmuseum.org. And again, thank you so much, Isaac. This was really fascinating conversation today.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Bye, everyone. See you soon.